ethics. Where then do we, how do we look at ethics in a different kind of way? And also within that kind of constantly changing world framework, how do you look at the question of humans, the need for human spirituality?
That's it. I came here as a U.S. historian. I'm not an ethicist. Okay. Well, let Michael.
Let me try that briefly. The word ethics comes from the Greek ethos, which means what holds a cultural group together, basic deep beliefs and so on. And so ethics is a social, cultural phenomenon, not an individual practice. And so what would be required to develop an environmental ethic? Well, what I would say is that you're going to need some changes in our understanding of what we are as human beings. I think let me put it this way. I think one of the problems we have with even introducing this topic of interiority is the disservice done by. Be very careful. I'm going to school. There have certain trends within U.S. Christianity which have really turned off a lot of thoughtful people in the sciences and social sciences and humanities, for that matter. And this is a shame because Christianity and other religious traditions have a lot to offer, including ethos. And one of the things I think we're missing right now is an ethos which is promotive of a deep appreciation of what human beings are. We're increasingly conceiving ourselves as smart animals. And smart animals will do whatever they can and are justified in doing whatever they can to maximize their fitness. And if that, as I said in my paper, that does not leave any room for consideration of the fate of other animals or other life forms, except insofar as if harming them somehow harms us. That's not a very significant environmental ethics. You can't call that environmental ethics. That's just prudential behavior. So I think we need to rethink this is the limitations of naturalism, which is the main way in which self-understanding has been defined, especially in North America. So how do you move beyond naturalism without becoming anti-naturalistic? How do you integrate naturalism into a more comprehensive understanding of being human? I think that's a step which would help address, even if somewhat indirectly, a lot of the issue of environmental ethics.
Does the kind of interiority theory that you would like to foreground get us to addressing environmental issues at the ecosystemic level? Or is ecosystem not a useful matrix for thinking about the imbalance that you've diagnosed?
Well, we were chatting about this a lot. I asked, based on Leopold's work, I asked Larry, about, he understood animals have some kind of perspective, but he was emphasizing the preservation of species because that work was so important for him. But as we all know, species only function within habitats, and those are dependent on more encompassing ecosystems. But it becomes we can identify to some extent with organisms, individual organisms and species because we are those. But, and maybe even a bit with habitat, because we can understand we're part of a river valley and there's mountains over there, but ecosystems and so on get pretty abstract. So the cultural work that would have to be done, the narratival work, the metaphorical work, the imaging work, that needs to be done. We haven't done a very good job of that. And I don't know what exactly it would look like, but to get that, to express that in a way that people can identify with it in a significant way, that's going to be difficult. And we know that the approach we've taken so far hasn't done a very good job. And we have all kinds of facts about the matter. We have pretty good evidence. We have really good descriptions. We've got scientific data. But these have not had the emotional effect, the interior effect needed to make people make significant changes. And so I don't know exactly how to go about it, but I see meetings like this as a hopeful sign that we're moving in the right direction.
Yes, sir.
Michael, I think this is first an observation, but it applies to all of you. In one of your last slides, you showed the academic disciplines divided into 4 neat quadrants. And I noticed under the social sciences, you didn't have public policy listed as a separate discipline. But
I just couldn't fit them all in.
Curiously, public policy was exactly designed in order to span many different disciplines: anthropology, physical sciences, natural sciences, economics, law, political, all there. So I thought it was curious that it wasn't there. But it was also interesting that I didn't hear all of you today talk about specifically how do you engage in the public policy process. What's working about it, what doesn't work about it. And Michael, you didn't quite answer the question. What does need to happen with public policy? How do you engage policymakers?
Well, let me put it this way. Let me give you an example that would help out. Because in all their discussion of public policy mentioned only the social sciences. There's no mention of the interior spheres because it doesn't deal with those. So let me give you this example. Wilbur uses this example. You use it with many different examples. Let's say you're a social scientist studying the Hopi rain dance. You don't have to ascribe any interiority at all to those people doing the dance. You're using a methodology, a lens, and a set of perspectives and so on, which are completely external. It's all about the publicly observable behaviors, the patterns, their relationship to economics, political structures, all that kind of stuff. You can go a long way with that. And that's what public policy does. For example, with respect to, at least until recently, even the World Bank's taking culture seriously again, or for the first time, I should say. But the Hopi rain dance also is a cultural phenomenon. There's a meaningfulness to that practice for those people who are doing it, which does not show up within the lenses of the social sciences and public policy. So how are you going to motivate people and understand people, especially at the local level? You have to understand why they do what they do. And that's not, and so public policy has to consult in a different way. Now, I think that's starting to happen. I think that even the World Bank's starting to do that. But we've got a long way to go.
I guess I would argue with you that I don't think that's quite true. I mean, I think that there is a branch of interpretive public policy, symbolism, social network analysis, that's been going on for a long time. It probably hasn't been used. But there are methodologies that do exist out there.
Well, if it hasn't been used, it's not going to show up on my radar screen. So you've got to, inform me.
But isn't the problem also that people in the humanities dealing with philosophy, history, literature, have taken themselves out of the policy arena? They don't feel they have anything to contribute. They don't want to talk about these issues. When they're asked a direct question, as I was just asking you, pass it on quickly. If you hadn't let me, I would have tried to come up with something. But it's very easy for people to say, well, that's not my field, and so forth. And then we turn it over to the economist. And the economists are quite happy to say, hey, I've got an answer for it.
Except some of them are trying to drag us back in. There's a lot of interesting examples of that, too, that we can talk about.
Yes.
I guess my question, where I'm dancing around, is somewhere in between the metaphors for ecological change, because I'm maybe more toward, as a scientist, the apocalyptic kinds of change than stewardship. And thinking about, as we go forward, do we use a sort of personal virtue ethics that has to do with the meaning of being human, rather than an ideal of what we think we're trying to accomplish or want to see in the external world as our guide, or if there's some way to bring those together.
A reciprocal challenge to the public policy challenge. Yes. Did you?
Oh, I was just down there. I thought perhaps some of these, you're right.
I think that's the whole point of what the Confucian tradition is up to. It says that change is an internal process of cultivation, but it also has relevance to the world. So I don't think this is an either-or. And systemic change of institutions is going to take a whole range of policy issues and economic incentives and tax incentives and so on. But I think what a whole section of my paper was suggesting is why the scientists and policy people are calling on humanities is this value component, and that it has to be dialogical. But I want to come back to Dan's challenge, which I think is a very important one, about the record, the Chinese record, or any other civilization's record. What I was suggesting, again, in a very condensed period of time, is that this is why we need the conversation with the environmental historians very much. But I do want to say that the historical record, deforestation notwithstanding, irrigation systems out in Sichuan that are still working, 2,000-year-old irrigation systems, would suggest that my point being is that this was a politics that worked for a common good based on an agrarian system that said water management, planting of rice, and so on needed to be attended to. That, in and of itself, was an ecological motivation. Ian Anderson out at Davis has done a very interesting book called Ecologies of the Mind, which is about East Asian practices which are along the lines of what you were speaking about, but are actually ecologically fertile and efficacious. And he's an anthropologist who's done a fascinating study of that. And that's another topic that I didn't go into here. But I do want to say in the modern period, the greatest destruction in China has happened under the Marxist rule, the greatest environmental destruction. If you look at Judith Shapiro's book of Maoist destruction of the ecosystems and animal life and birds and so on, it's massive. And some of this has been documented in the Bad Earth book of Schmiel. But I think, so any system, what I was suggesting, has its autocratic potential and has its ideals that are not lived up to, for sure. That's worldwide, which is why I don't think any one religious system has the answer. It's not Asian traditions, it's not indigenous traditions. We can't idealize. But I do want to say that I think what Du Weiming is doing is relative to this question, related importantly, because the loss of Confucianism as a tradition in China, and that, we can trace that way back to the 19th century and the May 4th movement in the early 20th century. But what Du Weiming is trying to do is suggest the indigenous roots of China need to be revived in relationship to modernity. And that has had some very serious traction. And DeBerry's work at Columbia and Weiming's work has been translated back into China. And when Peng Yue, the deputy vice minister of the environment, said we need in China an environmental ethics, we need it based on Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism. And in part, it's one of the reasons why we started this conference series, because we said it has to be indigenous from within cultures around the world. They're not going to take a Western ethics in Southeast Asia or East Asia. And when Peng Yue, their own minister, wants to do this, I think there's some cause for a significant reappropriation in this context within the countries and cultures themselves.
Just a brief remark or two about humanists engaging the public policy sector. Then I'll see if Michael might want to add something, and then on we go to whatever is of concern from the floor. I'm sure a number of you know about the short-lived involvement of George Lakoff, Berkeley linguist, during recent political campaigns, being enlisted by Democrats to try to come up with rhetoric that would really sing and work on the party's behalf. That was relatively short-lived but worthy kind of experiment, I think, in enlisting the help of a humanist who has done crossover work in the past of a bookish nature, and that it had ambiguous results. I don't think it proves its unworthiness as a strategy. I have colleagues in the field of rhetoric, and let me just say, as for myself, I would add to Don Worcester, nostras culpas, this is not me, but others that I know, who have helped further grassroots activities in different regional advocacy movements, both through observation and write-up and through consulting, locals on how to tell their stories persuasively in ways that commissioners trying to adjudicate environmental issues might be moved by. I wanted to see if I could put the bite on Michael to say anything at this point, because if I understood correctly, when you were in Queensland, that had something to do with trying to assist one of the Aboriginal groups in some campaign that they were attempting. Am I right about that? And I'm asking you partly just on that account, and partly because of the wonderful way that you do narrative in your own scholarship, wondering if that might have been a part of what you were trying to help equip your friends on the ground to do more potently.
I'm dodging the question yet again. Larry, I'd sooner speak at least first to a couple of other questions. Somebody mentioned the fact that people living in an urban industrial society don't necessarily have much contact with nature. I think we should remind ourselves that there is not only nature in the sense of Umwelt that Michael was talking about before, but in the senses of Mitwelt and Eigenwelt, that the social world in which we lived is also imagined as a body. It has a nature. This is just not in positive sociology. I think it's deep in the experience of people in the modern world, as well as most worlds, that the human community is itself somehow an organic community. And then there is the question of the Eigenwelt, of human nature in the interiorized sense of what our nature is, what is innate to us, what is genetically predisposing us to certain forms of behavior, or the kind of tradition that explores the unconscious and the deep recesses of the unconscious as the repository of a kind of libidinal nature that corresponds somehow to wild nature outside of us. But I'd like to come back again to your challenge, Dan, because I think what you said is absolutely critical here. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I know a lot of people aren't going to like what I have to say, but it follows from my description of how Kuki-Yalanji people deal with thunderstorms. What I described is something that people then redescribed as a superstition. But it seems to me characteristic of all human beings everywhere. When the world is too much for them, when they feel they can't comprehend or control what's going on around them and inside them, that they have recourse to what is often called magical thinking or ritual activity, where one works oneself up into a sweat, a frenzy, or a kind of a passion of thought, which in a sense then gives one a sense that one is acting, something is happening, one is actually participating realistically in the world because one is so exercised by the issue. And so I'm going to suggest that what we're doing today is a ritual. What we're doing today is magical thinking. We, faced with the environmental crisis and scared of our inability to do anything about it, are, at least we humanists, doing what Kuki-Yalanji do and what human beings have done for centuries. Fall back on the Eigenwelt as a way of sympathetically, magically inducing some alteration in the Umwelt.
It's not 4 o'clock, it's the 10, right?
That sounded like a peroration, but it's not going to be. There are too many more people that want to speak. Roger Kennedy.
I want to go back to the public policy part of it. I should explain that I've worked for 4 cabinet officers and ran the National Park Service for Bill Clinton. So I think I have some standing to think about it anyhow. public policy isn't surely Gifford Pinchot telling people things. It's John Muir listening to people, too. Seems to me one of the primary values of this kind of session is that it permits us to listen to very disparate psychologies and competencies and seek to draw from those psychologies and competencies things that we might thereafter usefully do. Whether or not we agree with Professor Worster that there is nothing terrible to worry about, isn't it? And I'm sure I'm not being fair to you.
No, you're not.
But even if there weren't, wouldn't we want to care about any further irreversible damage done to our habitat as a consequence of things we did or didn't do?
Could you possibly disagree with that, Don?
No, of course not. No, we're seeing an enormous decline in species on this planet. It's happened before, but this time it's our moral responsibility. We have to stand up and take moral responsibility for it. I believe that completely. I just don't think this deep apocalyptic thinking that's out here right now is very constructive and helpful and hopeful. I think the situation is more full of hope than that would allow us. But that doesn't mean that we don't have serious things to be worried about.
Eco-apocalypticism, just speaking from my literary hat, has been certainly one type of discourse response that some humanists have encouraged and participated in, and you see widely echoed. Has its coinage been debased and its credibility been undermined? Is an open question. I'd encourage you to read a book by my brother or take a look at it. This is not nepotism. It's simply bibliography. Called From Apocalypse to Way of Life. Frederick Buell is the author. Routledge is the publisher. It's about right-wing disinformation attempting to discredit left-leaning apocalyptic rhetoric about the severity of environmental crises. And I think it's a sobering analysis that suggests that maybe the shelf life of eco-apocalypticism has some time to run yet and can be put to good use. Yes, sir.
Apropos of that, and also advanced reflections on Jeremy Jackson's Death of the World Oceans, there's a useful lens in this. And I would argue that window into the discussion of monism and dualism of Umwelt is the stuff of being human, the cytoplasm and the genes that make up humans. I'm revealing my stripe as a biologist, as an ecologist, and I'll confess that I'm an ecologist who's washed ashore in an international relations program. But that has me realizing that the argument has shifted somewhat. First, the current generation has 250 chemicals in its cytoplasm, particularly adipose tissue, that our grandparents did not have. So there's a chemical exchange, often locally mediated. This is a whole new shift on sense of place. And some of it is actually global. We're seeing atmospheric transport of pesticides, such that DDT that was banned for use in the U.S. and sold to India and in use in the Ganges River has now been redeposited into Lake Michigan. So there's a sort of scale that has changed the argument. But this is showing up in our own tissue, opening up the question of being a human or being any species is a whole lot more in exchange with environmental, physical, and chemical factors, whether it's sediment transported now from the Gobi Desert across into the Pacific Northwest, from China across the Pacific, changing air quality, or whether it's now, in a second means, the genetic shifts that we're seeing, we're bearing the impacts of some of the toxins. We're holding them in our own genotypes. And linked to that is a shift in how we're perceiving ourselves in terms of greater genetic similarity. I mean, key work done here, among other places, in terms of the number of genes we share with other species, not just those closely related to us, but house mice and others. is starting to shift a human's perspective on being so different and so self-contained from the rest, the Umwelt. And then you take that one step further, and I'll finish with that, and you realize that we are therefore open to a lot of exchange of epizootics. The avian flu is a nice example not only of the interaction of another genome that has been transported across the world, but also the open window nature of our makeup. And then our change of other species through genetic engineering, where for an art project, jellyfish phospholuminescence was encoded into the genome of a bunny rabbit that can now glow in the dark. There's human growth factor genes that have been spliced into trout that are spreading our genome. And you can ask, if you eat that trout, are you consuming human tissue? There are ethical issues linked to that. My point is simply, we've changed the nature of the discourse, the I-thou dichotomy, such that our genome, our cytoplasm, is now reflecting the environment in ways that it did not do so a generation ago or even 15 years ago. And I think that has some interesting relevance to some of the discourse, fascinating discourse today. And I defer this to the panel, which would have even far better and more interesting takes on it than I would.
I'm going to take that more as a statement than as a question and see if I can recognize as many people who haven't had the chance to speak as I can. Yes, back there, sir.
I would like to see if some of the threads that came up but which have not been discussed in a connected fashion, such as the notion of integral ecology, the grid of Ken Wilber's that was put up by one of the speakers, and the issue of dualism versus monism, cannot be looked at or reconciled from a perspective which brings us to the thought of Sri Aurobindo. And I want to know if any of the panelists of speakers are aware of the work in integral psychology, the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo, which is actually behind the grid that Ken Wilber uses, those 4 quadrants. And he has this notion, Sri Aurobindo, of evolution in consciousness. That is the direction that he sees for the human species. And that evolution in consciousness actually includes within itself a lot of the things we're talking about with regard to interiority, but without the kind of conflicts which labeling like monism and dualism gets us into. So I wanted to know if any of you are informed by that perspective.
Well, I'll just say, just very briefly, that Wilber frequently cites Aurobindo as one of his major inspirations, and often links him with Plotinus as kind of the Western Aurobindo. But Aurobindo is a 20th century thinker and fascinating. And so I just want to put that out there.
Yes, sir.
Yes, if you come back to your preoccupation with literature, I have a question to direct to you and Professor Worcester and the others that might like to comment. It has to do with whether there has not developed really a flowering of environmental writing over the last 30 years or so, located particularly up and down the Pacific coast. Names that have come up repeatedly today include Gary Snyder, Barry Lopez. We could also throw in the Northwest poets, Theodore Retke and his many fine students, Richard Hugo, Carolyn Kaiser. I could go on and on. Is it possible, and this is a question in the interpretation of contemporary literary and cultural history, is it possible to speak of the emergence of a green literary regionalism based primarily on the Pacific coast, which has enabled the environmental imagination, really to represent that part of the world, in a very distinctive way, and that is also politically responsible and has many connections with the environmental activism, which is such a characteristic of that region.
There's certainly been a renaissance in environmental writing, particularly environmental prose and poetry. during the last 40 or 50 years or so. There's no doubt about that. A good bit of it has happened in Western venues, that's true. And it's probably no accident that the eco-critical movement started as a movement within the Western Literature Association before it jumped to the national and then the international. But I wouldn't want to localize what's been happening in creative writing and the other arts simply in West Coast terms. You can see other examples around the country. Janice Ray's Memoirs of a Cracker Childhood, rural Georgia. Scott Sanders, Indiana writer. A number of New England writers that I could name, but some of them are my friends, and that would seem nepotistic again. But definitely the West Coast story has been a key part of the story. There's no doubt about it.
And prairies. Prairies are coming under a whole new reevaluation. Artists, photographers, writers of various sorts. This happened with deserts earlier. You know, in the 19th century, nobody wanted to go into deserts, and now we love them to death. It was a powerful reevaluation that took place because of creative minds and imagination.
Some of my favorites there are William Lee Steetmoon's Prairie Earth. You might think of him as a carpetbagger from Missouri pretending to be Native American. John Genovi, parasitologist from Nebraska, the Thoreau of the Plains, as he's sometimes called. We could go on. Yes, sir.
I remember we were talking about apocalyptic. One of the funniest, they're actually very kind of almost semi-unnerving moments at one of the early conferences that was on Taoism and ecology. And we were cheerfully sitting there working ourselves into a frenzy. And one of the Taoists looked at us and said, "What crisis?" He says, "It's just you Confucians and Christians again because you're good at managing crises. And so if there isn't one, you have to invent one." And he was making one of the points was, it's just all nature. Chernobyl's nature. My bonsai's in nature. What crisis? And it took a while. The attack mode on the guy was pretty intense. And he just, kept saying, well, that's what you Confucians and Christians do. In terms of the worldview, there was an article that Bob Bella wrote, I think in the early 60s, called Religious Evolution. And a lot of people didn't like it because they seemed to think it was, that somehow you started from archaic or primal traditions and somehow everything evolved. That's really not what he was talking about. He had this wonderful insight, and it came out way before any of this. And he'd been looking at Calvinism and Tokugawa Confucianism. He said it's really interesting that if you took a look at axial age religions around the world, there was an ever-accelerating curve of transcendence. Transcendence simply being, AFXB, but not the other way. So that you end up in the 16th century with the absolute heightened versions of this, where you had God, the Tao, totally transcendent of any relation to the world. I mean, you really had the absolute sense of transcendence. Still popular amongst my evangelical friends. And then he said, it all just kind of collapsed. And he said, I have no theory about why this happened, but the example I use is that, great-grandparents, the great translator of the early Confucian classics, James Legge, looking at a passage that Mary Evelyn was talking about, that heaven, earth, and man form a trinity. Well, Legge had a lot of trouble with that, and he actually called it vain and idle babbling. I mean, he couldn't get inside the worldview. My freshmen get inside that worldview. And, it's exactly what Bella was talking about. And Bella didn't really have a theory about why it happened, but he said he thought it was an absolutely fascinating. He has a little chart where it kind of goes, here goes the transcendence, and then something, and he said, I don't know, well, he does have a few theories about it, but you have a collapse, or you have a reemergence of what you would call dual transcendence or immanent transcendence, as Wei Ming would talk about. In other words, somehow or other, God and the world reconnect, and there's a much more sense of relationality there. And, that, in a sense, precedes So if we want to think cosmically of zeitgeists, it's just a very interesting article where this would all substantiate what he was talking about, but he just was noticing something in the 60s, or actually earlier centuries.
Thank you. Is there a couple more? No?
Maybe two short questions, and then it's good to have questions still coming because this will be an incentive for you to go across the street for this reception and continue to ask and talk. So,
okay. I'll do alliteration. Tovis and Tim.
I've been thinking about how Professor Jackson ended with on the note of relativism, or that's how you were being heard. And then also Professor Worster's talking about how liberal democracy was essential for the sort of flourishing of environmental protection movements. And I'm just thinking about how we're coming up on the third anniversary of the war in Iraq, and I'm just thinking of sort of the global implications of if your research is true, and the spread of liberal democracy is essential for environmental movements. I just feel like we should talk about that and how then we work to spread that, or there's just all these sort of implications, I think, of this, the way that liberal democracy is being used to justify certain kinds of movements today, by our government. And
you can't spread democracy through a gun.
Right.
I mean, that's the assumption that we're working by right now. It's just crazy.
But do you think it will be heard by other people around the world in a problematic way? I just feel like
it is.
Right. So how do we deal with that?
Totally confused by it. And, this country that preaches democracy and thinks it comes out of the barrel of a gun. It's got to be dislocating all kinds of people's understanding of the issues. And so we have no faith in the concept if we do it that way.
Let me address that, because Augusta Zarega, who's sitting right in front of you, wrote a wonderful article on describing the fact that democracies do not go to war with each other. Liberal democracies do not make war on one another. One of the biggest environmental problems we have is militarism. Trillions of dollars spent every year on weapons, mass destruction, and every country thinks it's got to have its army and so on. So, and many of these countries who are doing this are although we're the worst offender, but many of the countries are countries which are tyrannical societies, people have no say in what goes on. So an increase in liberal democracy would lead to a decrease in war tension, a decrease in the need for weaponry and weapons of mass destruction. How democracy gets spread, it's not being spread that way as in Iraq, but something like that is needed, and it's going to have to look like it looks in each place it develops. And the faster it develops, the better, as far as I'm concerned. But I don't know how to accomplish it.
Professor Tim Weisskell can now be counted on to say something incendiary.
Well, with that in mind, I'm curious about the awkwardness, shall we say, of humanities and the policy people, which was brought up earlier. And it seems to me it's precisely in this realm of religion, in part because those in the humanities are systematically uncomfortable in the presence of the dominant religion in policy circles, which is techno-scientific salvationism. That we can turn now, as it were, pulling the rabbits out of the hat, thanks to science, to, as it were, re-intervene into the natural world and save our own bacon. If that's not mixing too many metaphors. The notion that people who come from the scientific tradition can talk to the policy people and sort it out on climate is something that the humanists are a little nervous with, because it may already, in effect, be much bigger than either one of those communities understands, and the premise that they're proceeding on is this fundamental belief of public policy people, it's rampant over at the Kennedy School now, of techno-scientific salvationism, that we have it within our power to turn around the ecosystem. That's what's so unnerving for humanists.
Could you state it even more strongly than that, Tim? That right. That there's this sense of the politicization of science under right-wing regimes being in cahoots with a baleful politicization of institutionalized religion that has the political clout. Gee, that isn't a very happy note on which to end, but it points to something that we all need to address. Thank you very much, folks, for staying with us for a very long day.